The first thing people noticed was the sound. Not sirens, not ambulances. The deep chopping roar of military helicopters cutting through the cold Montana evening sky. 3 black government vehicles sped into the parking lot of Pine Valley Medical Center as the last sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Armed federal agents moved through the front doors with purpose. Nurses froze. Patients stared. Visitors stepped aside without being asked. At the far end of the lobby, a nurse named Grace Mitchell was being escorted toward the exit by hospital security. Fired, humiliated, finished. Her locker had been cleared. Her badge had been deactivated. The hospital administration believed they had finally gotten rid of the one employee who asked too many questions. Grace walked toward the doors carrying a small canvas bag, unaware that everything was about to change. Nobody knew yet that the federal agents hadn't come to investigate an accident. They hadn't come for the hospital director. They hadn't come for the board members hiding dangerous secrets. They had come looking for Grace Mitchell. Because somewhere inside one of those vehicles was a critically wounded federal operative fighting for his life. And the only person who could save him was the nurse who had just been fired. Within hours, a deadly highway disaster would flood the emergency room with victims. A hidden conspiracy would begin to unravel, and the quiet nurse everyone underestimated would uncover a truth powerful enough to bring down an entire hospital system. If this story grips you, stay until the end. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far Grace Mitchell's story. Cold wind moved down from the Montana mountains, carrying the smell of pine, wet pavement, and coming snow. Above Ashton Ridge, the evening sky hung low and gray over Pine Valley Medical Center. Grace Mitchell arrived before sunrise, as she always did, 12 minutes early and already tired in a way sleep could not cure. Pine Valley Medical Center stood 6 floors tall at the edge of Ashton Ridge, Montana, a town that looked gentle from the highway but carried hard winters, stubborn people, and secrets hidden behind polite smiles. The hospital served ranch families, retired miners, truck drivers, teachers, tourists from the mountain roads, and lonely old people who came in with chest pain, but mostly needed someone to look them in the eye and tell them they still mattered. Grace was 34 years old, though the calm in her face made some people think she was older, and the sadness in her eyes made others think she had already survived more than one lifetime. She was 5'7", lean from years of disciplined movement, with warm brown skin, dark hair usually tied into a tight knot, and gray-green eyes that noticed everything without making a show of it. A thin scar ran along the inside of her left wrist, pale and almost invisible, unless the light hit it. She never explained it. She rarely explained anything about herself. Grace believed explanations were useful only when they helped someone heal. Everything else was just noise. Most people at Pine Valley knew her as a quiet med-surg nurse who charted too much, smiled too little, and never joined gossip at the coffee machine. What they did not know was that before Pine Valley, before Ashton Ridge, before the small rented apartment with one plant on the windowsill and a Bible on the nightstand, Grace Mitchell had spent years as a combat medic attached to military rescue operations. She had treated wounded soldiers under fire, held pressure on wounds in dust storms, carried men twice her size through smoke, and learned the terrible truth that life often changed in seconds, while paperwork took hours to admit what had happened. She had come to Ashton Ridge looking for quiet, not happiness exactly. Happiness felt too bright, like a lamp turned on too suddenly in a dark room. Grace wanted usefulness. She wanted clean sheets, medication schedules, steady hands, and patients who survived because someone paid attention. She wanted a life where nobody screamed coordinates into a radio, where helicopters in the distance were medical transport, not warnings from the gods. But peace, she had learned, was not the same thing as being valued. At 6:00 bon matin a.m., Grace pushed through the staff entrance, badge clipped to her pale blue scrubs, and nodded to Roy Elkins at the security desk. Roy was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with thinning sandy hair, a square face, and kind blue eyes made watery by years of allergies and night shifts. He liked crossword puzzles, disliked drama, and treated Grace with the quiet respect of a man who recognized competence even when leadership did not. "Morning, Grace," Roy said, glancing up from his thermos. "Morning, Roy. Snow by tonight, they say." Grace looked toward the dark windows. "Then the hip fractures will start by tomorrow." Roy gave a dry chuckle. You nurses always know how to make weather romantic. Grace almost smiled. Almost. On the 4th floor, the med-surg unit was already awake in the restless, fluorescent way hospitals were always awake. Call lights blinked, monitors hummed. A food cart rattled somewhere down the hall. Grace checked the board before she even put down her bag. 7 patients assigned, 2 discharges pending, 1 fresh post-op from the night before. One elderly man in room 412 who had pressed his call button 6 times since Bezer AM. The night nurse had written anxious beside his name in hurried letters. Grace read that word and felt a small, familiar weight settle in her chest. In hospitals, anxious often meant afraid and inconvenient. Her charge nurse, Melody Shaw, stood at the desk with a tablet tucked under one arm. Melody was 42, tall and sharp-shouldered, with copper-red hair cut at her jaw and a face that had once been soft before too many budget meetings and understaffed nights carved it into angles. She was not cruel by nature, but she had learned to survive by passing pressure downward. Around administrators, Melody became obedient. Around nurses beneath her, she became thunder in comfortable shoes. You're on West Hall first, Melody said without greeting. Assessments? Meds, discharges. We're behind already. Grace glanced at the board. Room 412 has been calling all night. He's stable. He's scared. He's not your first priority. Grace looked at Melody, then at the blinking call light. There were rules written on paper, and there were rules written inside a person's bones. Grace had broken many of the first kind to obey the second. I'll be 7 minutes, Grace said. Melody's mouth tightened. Grace. But Grace was already walking. Room 412 belonged to Arthur Bell, a 76-year-old retired school principal recovering from hip surgery. Arthur was thin and long-limbed, with silver hair combed carefully to one side and dark, intelligent eyes that kept searching the doorway as if waiting for someone who had promised to come. His hands trembled slightly on top of the blanket. On the tray beside him sat untouched oatmeal, cooling into paste. You're Grace, he said when she entered. I am. You were here yesterday. I was. You explained the blood thinner. I did. Arthur swallowed. Am I dying? There it was. Not anxiety. Not inconvenience. The real thing. Grace pulled a chair beside his bed. She checked his vitals first, because kindness without competence was only decoration. His temperature was mildly elevated, his blood pressure acceptable, his oxygen normal. Then she sat down where he could see her face. No, Mr. Bell, she said gently. You are not dying. Your body is healing from surgery. Healing can feel frightening, especially when pain medication wears off and the room gets quiet. His eyes filled, but he blinked the tears back with the pride of a man who had once controlled classrooms full of teenagers and now needed help lifting his own leg. My daughter didn't answer, he whispered. Grace looked at the phone on his bedside table. Would you like me to try calling her after morning meds? She works nights. I don't want to bother her. Grace thought of all the brave lies lonely people told to make abandonment look like courtesy. We'll call her once, Grace said. If she's sleeping, she can ignore us. That gives her the choice. Arthur gave a small laugh, rough but real. You talk like a principal. I've been corrected by enough of them. When Grace stepped back into the hall 9 minutes later, Melody was waiting near the nurse's station. Her arms were folded. Her tablet was pressed against her chest like a shield. You were told West Hall first. Mr. Bell had a low-grade fever and unmanaged fear. Both affect recovery. Fear doesn't go in the medication scanner. No, Grace said. But it shows up in blood pressure, pain scores, sleep quality, mobility, and whether he trusts us enough to tell the truth. Melody looked away first, which made her angrier. You always have an answer, Grace did not reply. She had learned long ago that some people called it attitude when a woman refused to shrink. By mid-morning, Grace had completed her assessments, corrected a medication discrepancy in room 426, caught early signs of dehydration in a woman recovering from bowel surgery, and stopped a discharge from going out with the wrong wound care instructions. None of it was dramatic. No alarms blared, no one clapped. Good nursing often looked like nothing happening because the disaster had been quietly prevented before it found a voice. At Tamzer Mulam AM, Richard Kane entered the 4th floor. People noticed. They always noticed. Richard Kane was 56, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and handsome in the polished, expensive way of men who believed rooms improved when they entered them. His jaw was clean-shaven, his suit navy, his shoes shining black enough to reflect the hospital lights. His eyes were pale blue and cold, not empty, but calculating, like a man measuring whether a person was useful, dangerous, or beneath consideration. He had once been a skilled hospital administrator, according to older staff, but ambition had eaten the better parts of him slowly, leaving behind a man who loved authority more than service. Richard did not walk through Pine Valley Medical Center. He inspected it. A crooked chair irritated him. A slow elevator offended him. A nurse sitting for 30 seconds became, in his mind, proof of moral decay. He smiled warmly at donors, spoke softly to board members, and humiliated staff in public with the clean precision of a surgeon making an incision. He stopped behind Grace while she was charting. "Nurse Mitchell." Grace finished typing the medication note before turning. "Mr. Kane." His smile appeared. It did not reach his eyes. "Still writing novels in the chart?" Grace kept her hands still. "Clear documentation protects patients and slows workflow. Unsafe workflow slows recovery." A nearby nurse, Jenna Ortiz, suddenly became fascinated by the supply drawer. Jenna was 29, petite, with glossy black hair in a ponytail, and a nervous habit of biting the inside of her cheek whenever conflict appeared. She liked Grace, but fear had made her careful. Pine Valley had a way of teaching good people to look away. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice only enough to make the insult feel private while keeping it visible to everyone. "You know, Grace, collaboration is not your strongest quality." Grace looked directly at him. "That depends on whether collaboration means patient care or silence." For one brief second, something dark passed through Richard Kane's face. Not rage. Rage was too honest. This was recognition. He had found a stone that would not bow to his boot. "Be careful," he said softly. "People who don't fit the culture often discover the culture can survive without them." Grace felt the old part of herself wake up, the part trained to read threat without flinching. Her pulse did not quicken, her hands did not shake, but somewhere inside, something tired whispered, "Here it comes." Richard walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and fear. By noon, the complaint arrived. It concerned a patient from the previous week, a man whose pain medication had been delayed after a call light malfunctioned during the night shift. Grace had been on duty. The maintenance log showed the call light failure. Her notes showed she had rounded on him twice during the gap. The medication record showed the delay had been caused by pharmacy verification, not nursing neglect. The truth was all there, plain as daylight, if anyone cared to read it. Richard Kane did not care to read it. At high p.m., he appeared in the main corridor outside the fourth-floor nurse's station, holding a printed sheet. Melody stood behind him, pale and stiff. Jenna was at the medication cart. 2 orderlies paused near the elevator. Dr. Samuel Reed, the emergency physician who had come upstairs to consult on a patient, stopped mid-step. Samuel Reed was 48, lean, with tired brown eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, and the weary posture of a man who had spent too many years trying to be decent inside systems that rewarded cowardice. He noticed the paper in Richard's hand and frowned. "Grace Mitchell," Richard said. Grace came out of room 418 carrying a chart. "Yes? We need to discuss a serious complaint." Grace looked at the hallway, the watching faces, the patients' doors. "Then we should discuss it in HR." Richard's smile hardened. "This will only take a moment." A strange calm moved through Grace. It was the same calm that came before impact, before incoming fire, before a monitor flatlined and the room waited to see who would move first. Richard lifted the paper. "A patient under your care reported being left in pain for more than 2 hours. The call light malfunction was documented. I rounded manually. The delay was pharmacy verification. I'm not interested in excuses, they're facts." The hallway went silent. Richard stepped closer. "Facts? Here is a fact. I have had concerns about your attitude, your communication style, and your inability to integrate with this team for months." Grace heard Arthur Bell's television murmuring behind a closed door. She heard the faint squeak of Jenna's shoes. She heard Melody breathing too fast. Grace thought of rent due in 3 weeks, of the savings account that could carry her for maybe 2 months, of the quiet life she had tried to build from the ruins of a louder one. She thought of every patient she had stayed late for, every mistake she had caught, every insult she had swallowed because the work mattered more than pride. "I have done my job," Grace said. Richard's eyes sharpened. "No, you have done what you wanted and called it virtue." Dr. Reed shifted. "Richard, This should not be handled here. Richard did not even look at him. Dr. Reed, this is an administrative matter. It's a public humiliation, Dr. Reed said quietly. For the first time, Grace looked at him with surprise. Not many people at Pine Valley spent courage in public. It was expensive currency. Richard's jaw tightened. Grace Mitchell, effective immediately, your employment with Pine Valley Medical Center is terminated. Security will escort you out. Clear your locker. Jenna's hand flew to her mouth. Melody looked down. One of the orderlies muttered something under his breath. Dr. Reed stared at Richard with disgust, but disgust did not undo the words. Nothing did. Grace stood very still. Inside her, something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the soft sound of a door closing in an empty house. She had survived battlefields, but this was a different kind of wound. A battlefield at least admitted it wanted blood. Places like Pine Valley smiled while they cut you and called the knife policy. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to list every patient, every saved life, every documented warning they had ignored. She wanted to ask Melody why silence tasted safer than truth. She wanted to tell Richard Kane that power was not the same thing as leadership, that fear could organize a building but never heal it. Instead, Grace placed the chart carefully on the counter. Room 412 needs a temperature recheck in 1 hour, she said. Room 426 needs the corrected dose confirmed before evening meds. Mrs. Alvarez in 419 is showing early dehydration signs. Encourage fluids and monitor output. Richard blinked, thrown off by the calm. Grace looked at Melody. Please don't miss those. Melody's face crumpled for half a second before she rebuilt it. Grace. But Grace was already walking. Her locker took 4 minutes to empty. There was almost nothing inside. A spare cardigan, a protein bar, a small notebook, a folded photograph of her younger brother, Caleb, taken years ago before the accident that had stolen his future and sent Grace into military medicine looking for a way to save strangers she could not save at home. In the picture, Caleb was 17, grinning beside a lake, all elbows and sunlight. Grace touched the edge of it with her thumb before placing it in her bag. 2 security guards waited outside. One was Roy Elkins. The other was a younger guard named Mason Pike, 24, tall, freckled, with a blonde buzz cut and the miserable expression of a golden retriever ordered to bite someone. Mason could not meet her eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. Grace nodded once. Just walk. They escorted her down the hallway. Staff pretended to work. Patients watched through half-open doors. Richard Kane stood near the nurse's station, like a victorious king surveying a conquered village. Grace did not give him the gift of looking back. At the front lobby, the automatic doors opened to the cold Montana afternoon. Wind swept in, sharp and clean. Grace stepped outside with her small bag on her shoulder, her badge deactivated, her career in that building reduced to an administrative decision made by a man who had never once held a frightened patient's hand in the dark. Behind her, Pine Valley Medical Center continued humming, as if nothing sacred had been broken. Grace stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the cold. She felt humiliation. Yes, but beneath it was something older and heavier. Grief. Not for the job, for the patients, for the nurses too afraid to speak. For the woman she had tried to become, the quiet civilian with steady hours and a peaceful life. That woman seemed to be slipping away from her now, like snow melting before it touched the ground. She adjusted the strap of her bag and began walking toward the parking lot. Grace Mitchell did not know that within minutes, sirens would tear open the mountain road. She did not know that federal vehicles would soon thunder toward the hospital doors. She did not know that the same people who had watched her leave in silence would soon be praying for her return. All Grace knew was that she had been fired, humiliated, and dismissed. And the story that would change. Grace Mitchell had only reached the far edge of the employee parking lot when the first siren shattered the cold Montana evening. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains, sharp and urgent, bouncing across the gray sky that hung over Ashton Ridge like a heavy blanket. Grace paused beside her aging silver pickup truck and looked toward the highway beyond town. Years of emergency medicine had trained her ears differently than most people. She could often tell the scale of a disaster simply by listening. 1 ambulance could mean anything. 3 ambulances meant trouble. 5 or more meant catastrophe. Within seconds, she heard a second siren, then a third, then a fourth. Grace slowly turned toward Pine Valley Medical Center. Something was very wrong. The automatic doors behind her burst open. A young emergency department technician named Tyler Brooks sprinted outside carrying a trauma bag. Tyler was 23 years old, lean and athletic with short blonde hair, freckles across his nose, and the restless energy of someone who still believed hard work could fix every problem. He had graduated from EMT school less than 2 years earlier and idolized experienced nurses like Grace. Tyler nearly ran past her before recognizing her. "Grace," she stopped. "What happened?" Tyler looked breathless. "Mass casualty alert." Grace's stomach tightened. "How many?" "Nobody knows. Multi-vehicle pileup on Interstate 17. State police say at least 20 vehicles involved." Grace looked toward the distant highway. The sinking feeling in her chest grew heavier. Interstate 17 cut through steep mountain roads north of Ashton Ridge. During bad weather, visibility could disappear within seconds. A pileup there could easily overwhelm an entire regional hospital. Tyler glanced toward the emergency entrance. "They need everyone." Grace almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because 30 minutes earlier they had fired her. Now they needed everyone. The irony felt almost cruel. Before she could answer, the first ambulance screamed into the emergency bay. The vehicle barely stopped before paramedics jumped out. Another ambulance followed immediately behind it. Then another, and another. Grace could see panic already spreading inside the hospital. Nurses running, phones ringing, security moving stretchers, doctors shouting orders. The carefully controlled machine of Pine Valley Medical Center was beginning to break apart. Tyler swallowed. "You don't work here anymore." "No, but people are going to die if nobody helps." Grace closed her eyes briefly. She could still hear Richard Kane's voice. "You're terminated. Clear your locker. Security will escort you out." The humiliation still burned. The anger still lingered. But another memory rose beside it. A younger version of herself kneeling beside a wounded soldier in a foreign desert. The soldier had looked at her through blood-covered eyelashes and whispered 3 words. "Please don't leave." Grace had never forgotten that face. She never forgot any of them. The wounded didn't care about politics. The dying didn't care about pride. A patient bleeding on a stretcher didn't know who signed termination paperwork. Grace opened her eyes. "Show me where they need help." Tyler visibly relaxed. "I knew you'd say that." Together they moved toward the emergency department. Inside, chaos had already arrived. The emergency room was overcrowded before the disaster even started. Now it looked like a battlefield aid station. Patients lined hallways. Stretchers occupied every available space. Medical supplies disappeared faster than staff could replace them. Dr. Samuel Reed stood near the central nurses' station. The physician looked exhausted. His brown eyes were bloodshot. His beard was unshaven. His white coat already carried stains from multiple trauma assessments. When he saw Grace, surprise crossed his face. Then relief. Pure relief. "Thank God." Grace glanced around. "What's the situation?" Samuel immediately shifted into briefing mode. Bus-carrying tourists lost control on black ice. Triggered chain reaction. Multiple rollovers. "We're expecting 30 to 40 patients." Grace felt her pulse quicken. That number was devastating for a hospital Pine Valley's size. "Available surgeons? 1. Trauma bays? 2. Critical nurses?" Samuel hesitated. The answer told her everything. "Not enough." Grace nodded once. "Who's running triage?" Nobody answered. That was the problem. No one was. Everyone was reacting. Nobody was leading. Grace immediately stepped into motion. Years of military medicine took over. Her voice became calm, controlled, confident. The kind of voice people followed automatically during disasters. "Listen up!" The emergency department quieted slightly. Not completely, just enough. "Every non-critical patient gets moved to waiting rooms or observation areas," she pointed. "Use the physical therapy wing if you have to." Several nurses exchanged looks, then started moving. Red tags stay here, yellow tags go east hallway. Green tags get reassessed every 30 minutes. Samuel watched her. The transformation was remarkable. This wasn't the quiet med-surg nurse anymore. This was someone else, someone forged by pressure, someone who had seen worse, much worse. A paramedic burst through the doors. "Incoming critical!" The first trauma patient arrived, a teenage girl, 16 years old, blood covered half her face. The paramedic shouted information. "Emily Larson, passenger in school shuttle, head trauma, possible internal bleeding." Grace immediately moved beside the stretcher. Emily Larson looked fragile beneath the blood. She had curly brown hair matted against her forehead and pale skin drained of color. Fear trembled in her eyes. Grace squeezed her hand. "Emily, look at me." The girl focused. "Good, very good, still responsive. Stay with me." Emily nodded weakly. Grace rapidly assessed injuries: concussion, broken arm, possible abdominal trauma, bad but survivable if handled correctly. The next hour became a blur. Patients arrived faster than beds became available. Doctors worked without stopping. Nurses ran between rooms. Phones rang endlessly. The smell of antiseptic mixed with blood and sweat. Grace barely noticed the passage of time. Her world narrowed to priorities. Who could wait? Who couldn't? Who needed surgery now? Who needed blood? Who needed someone simply to tell them they were not alone? At Namza Bonmitam PM, another ambulance arrived. This one carried a victim unlike the others. The patient was a large man in his early 40s. Muscular, unconscious, multiple chest injuries, no identification. Only 2 state troopers accompanied him. One of them, Officer Daniel Hayes, approached Samuel Reed. Daniel was 38 years old with broad shoulders, dark hair cropped short, and the weathered face of a man who had spent 15 years dealing with tragedies along Montana highways. "We found him near the wreck site. Passenger? No." The officer lowered his voice. "He wasn't involved in the crash." Grace noticed immediately. That statement changed everything. "Then why was he there?" Samuel asked. Daniel shook his head. "Don't know." Grace examined the patient. Something felt wrong. Not medically, personally. The man's injuries were real, but his hands told a different story. Calluses, scars, military bearing even while unconscious. This was not an ordinary traveler. The patient briefly opened his eyes, only for a second. His gaze landed on Grace. Confusion flickered there, then urgency. His lips moved, she leaned closer. "What?" The man whispered something barely audible, then lost consciousness again. Grace froze. The words were simple, yet strange. "Tell Harper." Samuel noticed her expression. "What did he say?" Grace looked toward the ambulance bay. A cold feeling moved through her chest. "I don't know." That was not entirely true. She knew the words. What she didn't know was why hearing them suddenly felt dangerous. Before anyone could discuss it further, another alarm sounded. More ambulances, more patients, more chaos. The disaster wasn't slowing. It was growing. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, events were already moving toward Pine Valley Medical Center. Events none of them understood yet. Grace returned to work, patient after patient. Injury after injury. Life after life. She never noticed the black military helicopter crossing the distant mountains. She never noticed the convoy of dark vehicles turning onto the road leading toward Ashton Ridge. She never noticed the message being transmitted across federal channels. All she knew was that people needed help. And Grace Mitchell had never been able to walk away from that. As darkness settled across Montana, the emergency department fought to stay ahead of disaster. But something much larger than a highway accident was already coming. And before the night was over, Pine Valley Medical Center would discover that one of the wounded men inside its walls was connected to a secret capable of destroying far more than careers. Snow began falling shortly after midnight, drifting quietly across Ashton Ridge, while most of the town slept unaware that Pine Valley Medical Center had become the center of something far larger than a highway disaster. Inside the hospital, exhaustion hung over every hallway. The emergency department had finally settled into a fragile rhythm. The worst victims from the interstate pileup had either been stabilized, transferred, or taken into surgery. Nurses moved slower now, running on adrenaline and caffeine. Doctors sat for brief moments before being pulled away again. Grace Mitchell stood alone near a window overlooking the parking lot. The military helicopters were still there, so were the armored vehicles. That alone told her something important. Whatever Ethan Brooks had been involved in was not routine. Behind her, footsteps approached. Colonel David Harper stopped beside the window. For several seconds, neither spoke. Both watched the snow. Finally, Harper broke the silence. "You saved his life." Grace kept looking outside. "He isn't safe yet. No." Harper nodded. "But he would be dead without you." Grace said nothing. Praise had never been comfortable for her. Too many good people had died despite everyone's best efforts. Survival was never guaranteed, only the attempt. Harper studied her quietly. "You remind me of someone." Grace glanced toward him. "Who?" "A medic I served with years ago." His expression darkened slightly. "Best medic I ever knew." "What happened?" "He stayed behind." The answer was simple. Military people often use simple words to describe unbearable memories. Grace understood immediately. The medic never came home. Harper looked away. I spent years wondering if I could have ordered him differently. Grace recognized survivor's guilt. She had seen it in soldiers, in nurses, in herself. Sometimes people survived tragedies physically while part of them remained trapped there forever. Before either could continue, the operating room doors opened. Everyone nearby turned. Dr. Amelia Vaughn emerged first. Amelia Vaughn was 54 years old, tall and slender with silver blonde hair pulled into a practical bun. Deep lines framed her face, earned through 3 decades of trauma surgery rather than age alone. Her gray eyes were sharp enough to make junior physicians nervous. Yet patients often trusted her immediately because kindness still lived behind the discipline. Years earlier, she had lost her husband to pancreatic cancer, an experience that permanently softened her view of suffering, while strengthening her intolerance for incompetence. The surgeon removed her mask. Ethan survived. Relief visibly moved through the military personnel. Several soldiers lowered their heads. One quietly whispered a prayer. Harper closed his eyes briefly, only for a second. Then military composure returned. Condition? Critical but stable. Amelia looked toward Grace. The decompression bought us enough time. Grace nodded. Amelia continued. Another 30 minutes and I would have been operating on a corpse. The statement silenced the room. Harper looked at Grace again. The gratitude in his expression deepened. Before anyone could say more, a nurse hurried down the corridor. It was Jenna Ortiz. Her dark ponytail was partially loose now, and fatigue showed clearly beneath her eyes. Dr. Reed needs you. Grace frowned. Why? Jenna hesitated. Because Richard Kane is demanding security remove you again. The hallway instantly became quiet. Harper's expression hardened. Amelia rolled her eyes. Of course he is. Grace sighed. She had almost forgotten about Richard Kane. Almost. The conference room on the administrative floor was already crowded when Grace arrived. Richard Kane stood at the center. Several department heads sat around the table. Dr. Samuel Reed was present, so was Melody Shaw. The atmosphere felt tense. Richard looked furious. Not loud furious. Dangerous furious. The kind that smiled while planning revenge. When Grace entered, his eyes immediately locked onto her. There she is. Samuel visibly winced. Grace remained calm. You wanted something? Richard folded his arms. You were terminated. Correct. Yet you're still practicing medicine inside my hospital. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Grace noticed that nobody defended him, not one person. That fact seemed to anger him even more. Samuel finally spoke. She helped save dozens of patients tonight. Richard ignored him. That isn't the point. No, Amelia said from the doorway. It really is. Richard's jaw tightened. Amelia entered the room. Few people challenged Richard Kane directly. Amelia Vaughn was one of them. She sat down, crossed her arms, and stared at him. I just spent 3 hours operating on a federal agent who survived because of Grace Mitchell. Richard forced a smile. That doesn't change employment policy. Harper entered behind her. Neither he nor Grace had noticed him approaching. The colonel closed the door. The sound echoed through the room. Suddenly everyone seemed smaller. Actually, Harper said calmly, it changes quite a lot. Richard turned. The military officer's presence seemed to catch him off guard. Harper placed a folder on the table. I spent the last 2 hours reviewing Miss Mitchell's personnel file. Grace blinked. Personnel file? Harper continued. Interesting reading. Richard looked uneasy. For the first time all evening, the colonel opened the folder. Performance evaluations describe her as difficult. Silence. Yet patient satisfaction scores consistently place her among the highest-ranked nurses in this hospital. More silence. Documentation concerns. He flipped another page. Yet multiple physicians noted her records prevented medication errors. Samuel nodded slightly. Harper kept reading. Poor team integration. Another page. Yet tonight virtually every nurse followed her leadership without hesitation. Richard's face slowly reddened. Harper closed the folder. Then he asked a simple question. Would you care to explain the discrepancy? Nobody spoke. Because there was no explanation, at least none that sounded respectable. Richard adjusted his tie. I manage personnel based on organizational needs. Harper's expression never changed. Interesting. The single word felt like a warning. Grace watched carefully. Something about this conversation felt larger than employment disputes. Harper wasn't just defending her. He was evaluating the entire hospital, almost investigating it. The realization unsettled her. Then something else happened. A woman entered carrying several binders. Grace didn't recognize her. The stranger looked about 40 years old, with short brown hair, glasses, and an analytical expression that suggested she noticed details other people missed. Her name was Claire Donovan. She introduced herself simply. Federal Auditor. The room immediately changed. Richard Kane's confidence visibly weakened. Claire sat beside Harper, opened one binder, and began reviewing documents. Grace noticed the hospital director's hands. For the first time since she'd met him, they were shaking, only slightly. But enough. Why? Claire adjusted her glasses. We've been reviewing emergency procurement records related to Pine Valley Medical Center. Richard forced another smile. I'm sure everything is in order. Claire didn't smile back, perhaps. That answer carried no reassurance, none at all. Grace noticed Samuel watching the exchange carefully. He seemed surprised too. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No decisions, no conclusions, just questions. Many questions. As staff filtered out, Samuel caught up to Grace in the hallway. What do you think is happening? Grace looked back toward the conference room. Through the partially open door, she could still see Claire reviewing documents. Harper stood beside her. Both looked serious. I think, Grace said slowly, that tonight isn't only about Ethan Brooks. Samuel followed her gaze. You think they're investigating the hospital. I think they're looking at something. The physician sighed. Honestly, I've wondered for years. Grace stopped walking. What do you mean? Samuel hesitated, then lowered his voice. There have been strange budget cuts. How strange? Nursing shortages despite record funding. Grace listened carefully. Samuel continued. Equipment requests disappear. Administrative spending increases. Departments lose resources. His eyes narrowed, and nobody gets clear answers. A cold feeling settled in Grace's stomach. Pieces began moving. Small things she had noticed over the past 14 months. Delayed equipment replacements. Missing training budgets. Staff positions never filled. Complaints quietly buried. At the time, they seemed unrelated. Now she wasn't so sure. Downstairs, the hospital continued functioning. Patients slept. Monitors beeped. Snow fell. But somewhere inside Pine Valley Medical Center, secrets were beginning to surface. And for the first time, Grace wondered whether Richard Kane's hostility toward her had never been personal at all. Maybe she had simply noticed too much. Maybe every question she asked had brought her closer to something someone desperately wanted hidden. Across the hospital, Ethan Brooks remained unconscious in intensive care. Machines breathed beside him. Monitors tracked every heartbeat. Nobody knew when he would wake. Nobody knew what information he carried. But several federal officials had already arrived. More were coming. Because Ethan Brooks was not merely a wounded federal operative. He was a witness. And whatever he knew had convinced the government to send military personnel, auditors, and investigators into a small Montana hospital during the middle of a snowstorm. Grace stood beside the ICU window and looked at Ethan's unconscious form. The feeling returned, the same instinct that had kept her alive during military deployments. Danger, not immediate danger, something quieter, something hidden, the kind that waited behind paperwork instead of gunfire. And as snow continued falling outside Pine Valley Medical Center, Grace realized that saving Ethan Brooks might have pulled her into a battle far more complicated than any she had faced on a battlefield. The real fight had not started. The snowstorm intensified before dawn, wrapping Pine Valley Medical Center in a curtain of white that seemed to isolate the hospital from the rest of Montana. Inside, however, sleep had become impossible. Grace Mitchell sat alone in a small consultation room on the second floor. The overhead lights were dim. A paper cup of coffee sat untouched beside her. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see nurses moving through the corridor, their shadows sliding across the floor like silent ghosts. In front of her rested a black spiral notebook, a simple notebook, one that had quietly followed her through 14 months at Pine Valley Medical Center. Most people would have seen nothing special about it. Grace knew better. Every few days she had written observations inside. Not accusations, not theories. Facts, dates, times, missing equipment requests, unexplained budget delays, patient complaints that disappeared from administrative review, staffing shortages that somehow existed despite reports showing increased funding. Grace had started recording everything because of habit. Military medics survived by documenting details. Details often became evidence. Evidence often saved lives. She never imagined the notebook would someday become part of a federal investigation. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Claire Donovan entered carrying 2 thick binders. The federal auditor looked even more exhausted than the previous night. Her brown hair was slightly disheveled. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, yet the sharp intelligence in her expression remained untouched. Claire sat across from Grace. "You keep good records." Grace shrugged. "I keep records because people forget." Claire opened one binder. "Fortunately for us, you don't." The auditor slid several printed documents across the table. Grace immediately recognized hospital procurement reports, but something looked wrong. Very wrong. Claire pointed to a highlighted section. 3 years ago, Pine Valley purchased 8 portable cardiac monitors. Grace nodded. "Sounds right. We located invoices." Another page appeared. "We located payment authorizations." Another. "We located insurance reimbursement requests." Grace frowned. "And?" Claire leaned back. "We never located the monitors." Silence filled the room. Grace stared at the documents. "How much?" "Almost $400,000. Grace slowly exhaled. "That wasn't an accounting error. That was theft," Claire continued. "We've identified similar discrepancies in 17 separate equipment purchases." The number shocked even Grace. 17, not 1, not 2, a pattern, an operation, something systematic. A second knock sounded. Colonel David Harper entered. Behind him came another unfamiliar face. The newcomer immediately attracted attention. Agent Marcus Hale looked like someone carved from granite. 47 years old, 6'3", broad shoulders, square jaw covered by short dark stubble, close-cropped black hair streaked with gray, a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked. His dark eyes carried the watchful caution of a man who had spent decades investigating dangerous people. Years earlier, Marcus had lost his partner during a federal corruption case in Chicago after a witness had been murdered before reaching trial. Since then, Marcus trusted evidence more than promises and paperwork more than politicians. He sat quietly, observing, evaluating. Grace instantly understood why people probably confessed around him. Not because he was intimidating, because he looked impossible to fool. Marcus opened a file. "Miss Mitchell, Grace is fine." He nodded. "Grace." His voice was deep and calm. "We've spent most of the night reviewing your notes." Grace waited. Marcus slid a photograph across the table. "Do you recognize him?" The picture showed a man in his 60s. Expensive suit, perfect smile, silver hair, political confidence. Grace recognized him immediately. "Warren Mercer." Marcus nodded. "Warren Mercer sits on Pine Valley's board of directors." Grace frowned. The board member rarely visited the hospital. When he did, cameras usually followed. Mercer was wealthy, influential, popular, exactly the kind of person newspapers loved. "What about him?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Claire. Then he placed another photograph beside the first. This one showed a luxury cabin hidden in the mountains. Then another, bank records, property records, corporate registrations. The pile continued growing. Grace felt a strange heaviness forming inside her stomach. "This is connected to the hospital?" Marcus nodded. "We believe Warren Mercer has been using multiple shell companies to redirect healthcare funding." Grace stared at the photographs. The smiling board member suddenly looked different. Not respectable. Predatory. The way certain people appeared once the mask slipped. Claire opened another binder. "We've traced millions of dollars." Millions. The word lingered. Outside the room, nurses continued caring for patients while money meant for equipment, staffing, and treatment vanished elsewhere. Grace thought of broken monitors, unfilled positions, overworked nurses, patients waiting too long, all while someone profited. Anger began stirring. Not loud anger, the quiet kind, the dangerous kind, the kind Grace carried when people were hurt unnecessarily. Marcus studied her expression. "You've seen things." Grace nodded slowly. "I didn't understand what I was seeing. You do now." Before Grace could answer, the consultation room door opened again. Dr. Samuel Reed entered. The physician looked uneasy, very uneasy. "There's something you need to see." Everyone followed him. The group moved through the hospital toward the administrative wing. The atmosphere felt different. Staff whispered. Security guards stood in unusual places. Rumors were spreading. People sensed change. Samuel stopped outside a records storage office. A woman stood waiting there. Her name was Evelyn Ross. Evelyn was 58 years old, short and slightly heavyset, with silver curls and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She had worked in medical records for 29 years and possessed the kind of memory that made computers seem unreliable. Evelyn avoided conflict whenever possible. Years earlier, a bitter divorce had taught her to survive by staying invisible. Tonight she looked terrified. Her hands trembled. I didn't know who else to tell. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's okay? Evelyn looked toward Marcus, then Claire, then Grace. Finally she swallowed. I found something. The room became silent. Evelyn opened a file cabinet, removed several folders, and handed them over. Claire immediately began reading. Her expression changed almost instantly. Shock, then disbelief, then anger. Marcus took one folder. His jaw tightened. What is it? Grace asked. Neither answered immediately. Finally Marcus looked up. Patient transfer records, Grace frowned. So? Claire slid one folder toward her. Look at the signatures, Grace did, then looked again. Something felt wrong. The physician's signature appeared inconsistent. Small differences, tiny variations. Most people would never notice. Grace did. Military medicine had taught her observation. This signature was copied. Claire nodded. Exactly. More files appeared, then more. The same pattern repeated, patient after patient. Transfer orders, modified diagnoses, questionable authorizations. Some patients had been moved into lower-cost treatment pathways. Others had received reduced care coverage. Every change created financial benefits, not for patients, for someone else. Grace felt cold. How many? Marcus answered. At least 30 confirmed cases. The number hit like a punch. 30 lives, 30 families, 30 people who trusted the system. Evelyn's voice shook. I thought I was imagining it. Grace looked at the older woman. No. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I should have said something sooner. Grace recognized the guilt. The same guilt honest people carried when corruption convinced them silence was safer than truth. You said something now. Evelyn nodded. Slowly. Tears escaped anyway. Claire carefully collected the files. We'll need every document. Evelyn pointed toward additional cabinets. There's more. Marcus looked toward Harper. The colonel's expression had become grim. The investigation was growing larger, much larger. As federal agents began cataloging evidence, Grace drifted toward a nearby window. Outside, snow covered the parking lot. The military vehicles remained. The hospital seemed peaceful, normal. Anyone driving past would see nothing unusual. They would never guess what was happening inside. Grace thought about Ethan Brooks, still unconscious. Still fighting. His arrival had started everything, or perhaps it had only revealed what had already existed. Behind her, Marcus received a phone call. His expression changed immediately. Not fear, urgency. The agent ended the call and looked toward Harper. We found another connection. Everyone turned. Marcus held up a sheet of paper. The fraudulent transfers don't stop with Pine Valley. Silence. Claire stared at him. What do you mean? Marcus looked around the room. There are 2 more hospitals. No one spoke. The implications were enormous. Pine Valley wasn't the entire operation. It was only one piece of something much larger. Grace felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she understood. What began as an unfair termination, then a mass casualty disaster, then a wounded federal operative, now a multi-hospital corruption network. The story kept expanding. And somewhere inside intensive care, Ethan Brooks still held answers nobody had heard yet. Marcus folded the paper. We need Ethan awake. Harper nodded. So do I. Grace looked through the ICU window down the hallway. Machines continued monitoring Ethan's recovery. For now, the man remained silent. But everyone understood the truth. When Ethan Brooks finally opened his eyes, the secrets hidden behind Pine Valley Medical Center might begin collapsing faster than anyone could control. And for the first time, Grace realized the investigation was no longer about saving a hospital. It was about exposing an entire system. The storm finally began to weaken on the 3rd morning. Sunlight broke through the clouds above Ashton Ridge for the first time in nearly 2 days, casting pale gold light across the snow-covered mountains surrounding Pine Valley Medical Center. To most people, it looked peaceful. Inside the hospital, however, peace was the last thing anyone felt. Federal investigators occupied conference rooms. Auditors reviewed records around the clock. Hospital administrators whispered nervously in hallways. Staff members avoided eye contact whenever board members appeared. The entire building felt like a house waiting for its foundation to crack. Grace Mitchell had not slept more than 3 hours since Ethan Brooks arrived. She sat in the ICU break room, reviewing copies of patient records Claire Donovan had asked her to examine. A pattern was beginning to emerge. Not every patient targeted by the fraudulent transfers had died. Some had survived. Others had simply disappeared into different care pathways. But one file immediately caught Grace's attention. The patient was still alive, Martha Collins, age 79, room 517. Grace frowned. Something about the chart felt wrong. Very wrong. Martha Collins had been admitted 6 weeks earlier following complications from a hip fracture. Her recovery notes were encouraging. Physical therapy progress was excellent. Vital signs remained stable. No terminal illness, no catastrophic diagnosis. Nothing remotely suggesting end-of-life care. Yet buried inside the electronic record was a pending transfer recommendation. Palliative care review. Grace sat upright. That made no sense. Palliative care wasn't inherently wrong. Many patients genuinely needed it, but Martha's condition didn't match the recommendation. Not even close. Grace opened additional records. Her stomach tightened. The authorization signature looked familiar. Too familiar. It resembled several forged signatures discovered by investigators the previous day. The same subtle inconsistencies, the same copied formatting, the same pattern. Someone was preparing to move Martha into end-of-life care. Someone who had no medical justification. A cold feeling settled inside Grace. She immediately stood. 20 minutes later, she entered room 517. Martha Collins sat upright in bed reading a paperback novel. The elderly woman looked surprisingly strong for someone approaching 80. Her silver hair was neatly styled. Her blue eyes remained sharp and alert. Decades of teaching elementary school had left her with an expression that somehow combined kindness and authority. Even now, she looked like someone capable of correcting grammar mistakes while recovering from surgery. When she saw Grace, Martha smiled. "You're the nurse everyone keeps talking about." Grace almost laughed. "I'm afraid that could mean several different things." Martha chuckled. A warm sound. "You saved people during the accident." Grace pulled up a chair. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day." Martha flexed her repaired leg. "The therapists say I'll probably be home within 2 weeks." Grace's concern deepened. This woman wasn't dying. She was healing. Someone had targeted her anyway. "Has anyone discussed changing your care plan?" Martha looked confused. "No." "Any conversations about long-term comfort care?" The older woman frowned. "Absolutely not." There it was. Confirmation. Grace checked the chart again. The transfer recommendation remained active, waiting, one final authorization away from execution. She felt anger rise, not because of paperwork, because someone had chosen Martha, a living woman, a recovering patient, a grandmother, a teacher, a human being, not a number, not a billing code, a person. And someone had decided her life was worth less than money. Grace immediately contacted Claire Donovan. The federal auditor arrived less than 10 minutes later, accompanied by Marcus Hale. After reviewing the chart, neither looked surprised, only angry. Marcus rubbed his jaw. "We've been expecting another active case." Claire stared at the screen. "Looks like we found it." Grace folded her arms. "What happens now?" Marcus answered. "Now we find out who authorized it." That process took less time than anyone expected. The reason was simple. Someone made a mistake. A careless one. The authorization request had been accessed from a workstation inside the executive administration suite. Not by a physician, not by a nurse, by an administrator. The investigation accelerated immediately. Federal agents began reviewing security footage, badge access logs, computer activity records, email archives. Every hour revealed new evidence. Every new discovery led toward the same people: Richard Kane, Warren Mercer, and several board members. By late afternoon, Claire Donovan entered the ICU's waiting room carrying a thick folder. Her expression told Grace everything. They had found something significant. "How bad?" Grace asked. Claire sat beside her. "Worse than we thought." The auditor opened the folder. Inside were financial records, property transfers, insurance claims, corporate registrations. The network was enormous. Millions of dollars, multiple facilities, years of activity. Grace slowly flipped through the documents. Then she stopped. One name appeared repeatedly. Linda Mercer. Grace recognized it immediately. Linda Mercer was Warren Mercer's younger sister and a senior board member at Pine Valley. Unlike her brother, Linda rarely appeared publicly. She preferred operating behind the scenes. Grace had met her only twice. The woman was elegant, wealthy, and intimidatingly intelligent. At 61 years old, Linda possessed silver blonde hair, flawless posture, and icy green eyes that seemed capable of evaluating a person's usefulness within seconds. People often described Linda as polite. Nobody described her as warm. Claire pointed toward several transfers. She approved these. Grace stared. The evidence was overwhelming. Hours later, events finally exploded. Federal agents arrived with arrest warrants. The hospital lobby filled with investigators. Employees gathered in hallways. Rumors spread instantly. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. Everyone knew something major had changed. Grace stood near the nurse's station when the first arrest occurred. Richard Kane exited an administrative office flanked by 2 federal agents. For the first time since Grace met him, Richard looked old. Not powerful. Not confident. Old. The carefully controlled image had shattered. His suit remained passive. His posture remained straight. But fear lived openly in his eyes. Now as he passed, Richard saw Grace. Their eyes met. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Richard stopped walking. The agents allowed it. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they already knew this moment mattered. Richard looked at Grace. "I was building something." His voice sounded tired, almost defeated. Grace remained silent. Richard laughed bitterly. "No one ever understands until they're responsible for keeping a place alive," Grace finally answered. "No." Richard frowned. "You think this is simple? I think people trusted you." The words hit harder than accusations. Richard looked away. For the first time, he had no defense, no explanation, no justification. The agents resumed walking. Seconds later, Richard Kane disappeared through the lobby doors. He would never return as director of Pine Valley Medical Center. The board arrests followed, not all immediately. Some members surrendered voluntarily, others required federal intervention. Warren Mercer had already been taken into custody. Linda Mercer was arrested at her home outside Denver. The network began collapsing. By evening, news crews arrived. Television vans filled the parking lot. National media picked up the story. Corruption, fraud, medical exploitation, millions stolen, hospitals compromised. The public demanded answers. For Grace, however, the most important moment happened quietly. Near midnight, no cameras, no reporters, no applause. Ethan Brooks finally opened his eyes. Grace happened to be checking monitors when she noticed movement. The federal operative blinked slowly. Confusion crossed his face, then recognition. His voice emerged rough and weak. "You're the medic." Grace smiled slightly. "I suppose I am." Ethan looked around. Tubes, machines, hospital ceiling, reality returned. "How long?" 3 days. He closed his eyes briefly, processing, then opened them again. "Did they get Mercer?" Grace nodded. "Yes." Relief visibly moved through him. The tension left his shoulders. Months of pressure seemed to disappear. For the first time since arriving at Pine Valley, Ethan looked peaceful. A few hours later, Colonel Harper arrived. He listened quietly while Ethan provided information. Information that completed the investigation. Information linking every remaining participant. Information investigators had spent years trying to obtain. By sunrise, the case was effectively over. The corruption network had collapsed. The victims would finally receive justice. Several days later, Pine Valley's board of directors held an emergency meeting. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different. No fear, no manipulation, no hidden agendas, only accountability. Grace entered the conference room expecting another difficult conversation. Instead, she found Samuel Reed, Claire Donovan, Colonel Harper, and the hospital's interim leadership team waiting. Samuel smiled, a genuine smile, rare for him. The interim administrator stood. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. Rebecca was 50 years old with dark skin, short curly hair, and the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades repairing broken healthcare systems. She extended a hand. "Grace Mitchell." Grace shook it. Rebecca smiled warmly. "We'd like to officially offer you the position of Director of Emergency Services." The room became quiet. Grace stared. For a moment, she thought she misunderstood. Then reality settled. The woman fired days earlier was being asked to lead the department. Samuel looked amused. "You earned it." Claire nodded. So did half the hospital staff. Grace sat silently. The offer should have been easy, simple. Everything she wanted. Stability, purpose, respect. Yet another thought lingered. Across the room, Colonel Harper seemed to notice, because he understood. When the meeting ended, he approached her privately. "You don't have to decide today." Grace looked toward the ICU, toward Ethan. toward the hospital she had nearly left forever, then toward the mountains beyond the windows. Harper spoke quietly. There will always be a place for someone with your skills. Grace smiled faintly. The same choice she thought she escaped years ago now stood before her again. A peaceful civilian life, or a return to missions where people desperately needed her. For now, she didn't know the answer. But she did know one thing. The truth had finally come to light. And sometimes God's greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder from heaven or signs written across the sky. Sometimes they arrive through ordinary people who choose courage when fear would be easier, truth when silence would be safer, and compassion when others look away. Grace Mitchell never set out to expose corruption or become a hero. She simply refused to abandon people who needed help. When powerful individuals tried to hide the truth, God used one nurse's integrity, one notebook filled with careful observations, and one decision to do the right thing to bring hidden darkness into the light. What seemed like the end of Grace's career became the beginning of a greater purpose, reminding us that God often works through ordinary people willing to stand firm when it matters most. In our daily lives, most of us will never face federal investigations, hospitals' conspiracies, or life-and-death emergencies. But every day we face smaller choices that reveal who we are. We choose whether to tell the truth when it is uncomfortable, whether to help someone who is struggling, whether to stand up for what is right even when nobody else does. These moments may seem small, but God sees every act of kindness, every sacrifice, and every quiet decision made with integrity. Sometimes the greatest miracles begin with a single choice that nobody else notices. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what lesson stayed with you most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of faith, hope, courage, and God's amazing grace. May God bless you and your family with peace in difficult times, strength when challenges arise, wisdom to make the right choices, and hope for every tomorrow. May He watch over your loved ones, protect your home, guide your steps, and remind you that you are never walking alone. Amen.